Putting an animal into your story is one of the best things you can do. Just think of all the popularity of cat videos on social media and news organizations, you know, saluting dogs who rescued humans. I mean, animals create waves, animals attract attention. People love animals, so why not have an animal in your book? Now in this video, we're not going to be talking about books where all the characters are animals, like Watership Down or Animal Farm. And we're also not talking about books where the main character is an animal, like The Art of Racing in the Rain or Jack London's White Fang. What we're talking about is human-centric stories where an animal plays a part. We're going to talk about 10 animal writing lessons that you can learn from famous authors. And pay attention until the end because the last 4 are the advanced techniques. Let's start with number 1, use animals to progress your plot. If you're struggling to find a way to make certain plot elements in your book really work, then you might need an animal to grease the wheels. Let's look at The Wizard of Oz by Frank Baum and the little dog Toto. Toto is absolutely essential for the entire plot of this book. In the beginning, he is the reason that the story starts. They are going to euthanize him, and so that's why Dorothy runs away. Toto's also the one that makes the climax work because he's the one that escapes the castle and brings the Tin Man and Scarecrow and Cowardly Lion to Dorothy. And in the end, Toto's also the one that makes Dorothy miss the hot air balloon, which ends up leading her to discover the power of the red shoes. Without Toto, the whole storyline of this book and movie don't work. So I would just recommend that you look at your own story to try to figure out ways where an animal could affect the plot in some way. The second thing we have to learn is use animals to characterize your humans. There's this old screenwriting advice that says, if you want to establish who your heroes and villains are, have your heroes save a cat and have your villains kick a puppy. They give that advice because how your characters treat animals reveals so much about who they are as a person. Let's look at All the Pretty Horses by Cormac McCarthy. John Grady Cole is this rough and tumble cowboy, but when he interacts with Red Bow, his horse, we see this tender, gentle side of him come out. And if that relationship with that horse didn't exist, then he wouldn't be as fully rounded or as likable as a character. I mean, look at these 2 quotes. Like, as he's riding his horse, he's just talking to his horse, telling it about the things he thinks are true. And then in another quote, he says, he thinks about horses and it was always the right thing to think about, which is the most cowboyish line ever, I think. Now, while we're on characterization, I should also mention that you need to do characterization work on the animal in your story too. They can't just be a formless, vague, like representative of a dog or a cat or a horse. They need personality. They need to seem different from other animals. The third way that you can use animals in your story is to make animals provide character motivation. There is some old screenwriting advice that says, never kill the dog. No matter what you do, don't kill the dog. You can have people dying like flies in apocalyptic scenarios, but like, keep the dog alive. You'll make people very angry if you kill the dog. But sometimes anger is the actual point. I think of John Wick when they killed his dog. What does he do? Oh, you know, he goes on a rampage and kills like 300 different people. And in many ways, the death of his dog launches the entire 4-movie franchise. I mean, can you imagine the John Wick storyline without his dog dying? It's central to the plot. Now, obviously, you don't need to have an animal die to provide character motivation. It could be that an animal needs cataract surgery or something, and a character needs to come up with money to provide that for them. It could be a very, you know, heartwarming story. But because people love animals so much, it creates extremely powerful motivation for your characters. The fourth tip that's going to help us write animals into our story is use animals to tug at our emotions. The first book that made me cry was a book about dogs. I'm sure a lot of you have read it. It's Where the Red Fern Grows. Billy gets 2 coonhounds, Old Dan and Little Ann. And by the end of that story, I mean, if you haven't read it, I don't want to spoil it for you, but by the end of that story, I was in my bedroom in the high desert of California, bawling my eyes out, like crying as I had never cried before. It's a heartbreaking story. And, but that's what animals can do to you, right? Like, we love animals so much. So you don't just want those animals affecting your character, you also want those animals affecting your reader's emotions as well. Here's another example from A Man Called Uwe by Frederick Bachman. So Uwe goes to his late wife's grave and he kind of like breaks down as he's talking to her. And in that moment, the cat, which he calls the cat annoyance because he's super grumpy, comes and just lays its head on his palm as if to comfort him. And it's such a sweet moment that really makes you feel like, oh yeah, this is what animals do for us. They comfort us in our darkest moments. And by the way, I talk a lot more about how to handle your character emotions and also the reader's emotions in my writing techniques course, and also in my how to write a novel course in my Bookfox Academy. So please check those out. The fifth way that you can use animals inside your story is to create leverage for the antagonist. So if you have an antagonist that needs to be pressuring your main character in some way, that needs to be attacking them in some way, but it's too early in the book for them to attack your protagonist physically, then oftentimes having your antagonist attack a proxy of your character, like a pet of theirs, works really well. Let's look at Harry Potter's Hedwig, which is a snowy owl. So Dolores Umbridge is sort of the antagonist of Harry in one of the books, and when she is intercepting letters, she ends up intercepting the letters from Hedwig, but ends up injuring the owl in the process. Now what this does is it really inflames the reader's emotions, making them even more angry at Dolores Umbridge. Because what kind of monster hurts an animal? Especially Hedwig. For another example of this, think of a story like 101 Dalmatians, where the main antagonist, their main goal is kidnapping all these dogs, and the intent is to make a coat out of them. I mean, that's such a horrible, horrible thing to do, Cruella. But once again, we more fully understand the depravity of the antagonist when we see what they're doing to these animals of the main character. A sixth thing you can do with animals in your story is to use animals for comic relief. If there is anything that we have learned from social media, it is that animals are really, truly funny. I could honestly list tens of millions of examples of this, but just for now, we're going to look at one story, Dr. Evil's hairless cat in Austin Powers, Mr. Bigglesworth. So Mr. Bigglesworth has lost all of his hair in the reanimation process, and the way that Dr. Evil interacts with Mr. Bigglesworth throughout the entire movie is actually hilarious, including like the crazy way that Mini-Me reacts to him. He tries to eat Mr. Bigglesworth and he has to be reproved.
No, we don't gnaw on our kitty.
But if you have a chance to throw a little bit of humor in your book with a dog or a cat or a parrot or whatever animal doing something funny, it's gonna tickle the funny bone of the reader and win you huge brownie points in your book. Now for these last 4 points, we're gonna look at some more advanced techniques that you can use in your story. Starting with number 7, animals as symbols. Probably a lot of you have read To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, and we have 2 animal symbols in this book. One is the one in the title, the mockingbird. Atticus Finch tells his children it's a sin to kill a mockingbird because a mockingbird does nothing wrong. It just makes music for people to enjoy. So the mockingbird in the story really represents a character who is innocent. And therefore it's wrong to kill Tom Robinson, who's falsely accused of raping this white woman, because he is one of those innocents. He's like a mockingbird. On the other hand, the Rabid Town dog, Tim Johnson, which is a funny name for a dog, but whatever, is a symbol of racism. The dog becomes rabid and wanders around town threatening to bite people, and in the end Atticus actually has to shoot it. And the rabid dog really represents all the racist town people. So I said this was an advanced technique, and I think now you see why. But I want you to think about animals in your book and what they can symbolize for the reader. Do they symbolize innocence? Do they symbolize anger? You can make an animal symbolize quite a lot. For the 8th way to incorporate animals into your story, let's look at animals as metaphors. So a lot of what we've talked about in this video so far is animals as a minor character in your story. But what if you just want an animal to play sort of a cameo role? You might know Barbara Kingsolver because she's written books like Demon Copperhead and also the Poisonwood Bible. But for this one, we're going to draw from one of her lesser known novels, The Bean Trees. In this book, there is a 3-year-old foster child who is being x-rayed at the doctor's, and the foster mom realizes that he has all these healed broken bones in his body. And she doesn't want to think about all the horrors that he's endured. So what she does instead is she looks out the window and she sees this tiny little bird flying around all the spikes of a cactus and into the cactus where it has a nest in there. And she doesn't make this explicit, but I think it's such a wonderful metaphor for what this child must have endured. This frail little bird of a child who, even when living in a cactus, right, in the cactus of domestic abuse and violence, finds a little nest and tries to survive in that situation. Now, as an author, if you think about what else Barbara Kingsolver could have done, she could have had the mom imagine very explicitly perhaps the violence that that child endured, but she didn't want to be that direct. She didn't want to be that explicit. Instead, she resorts to metaphor with an animal to symbolize what that child went through. So your goal might be to find an animal that reflects what your character has experienced. And here's one final example of this. In Frederick Buechner's Lion Country, there's a character whose twin sister is dying. Now, it's just too painful for him to deal with his sister dying. So what he does instead is he talks about a cat of his who is also dying. The cat's health struggles are a way to talk about his sister's health struggles, but talk about it in code. Now let's get to number 9, which is animals as spiritual guides. Animals quite often are more than mere animals. They can rise to the level of representative of some sort of spiritual reality. An obvious example of this would be in C.S. Lewis's Narnia series. You have the character of Aslan, who's a lion, and he's very obviously a Christ figure, to the point where he ends up being sacrificed as a substitute to save one of the human characters. Or you have a book like The Master and the Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov. In that book, you have an enormous black cat called Behemoth, and this character is very much like representative of a demon. He's a very funny character, yes, but ultimately a very dark and negative spiritual presence. And lastly, let's look at J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter. Think of Harry's Patronus, the stag. The stag symbolizes protection and guidance. It almost plays a kind of supernatural role in protecting him, kind of like a guardian angel would. And for our last and final point, let's look at animals as mirrors. So the role of a lot of animals in books or stories is simply to provide a mirror or to reflect what their human character actually is like. In Confederacy of Dunces by John Kennedy O'Toole, there is a dog who is so slovenly and lazy. And the main character, Ignatius J. Riley, comments on that and says like, oh, this is obviously my pet. He's exactly like me. So having a pet that's exactly like your main character is another way to characterize that character indirectly. In Gabriel Garcia Marquez's Love in the Time of Cholera, we also see a parrot, and the parrot's high intelligence really mirrors the owner's high intelligence. Or maybe some of you have thought of this already, George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones, we have direwolves, and the direwolves have this deep connection, almost mirroring the Stark children. Each direwolf is pivotal to the Stark children's identity and fate, and the direwolves really reflect the personality of these kids and these mystical aspects of the North. If you don't yet have an animal in your book, now is the time to add one. I hope one of these ideas helped stir up your imagination.